Okay, now we are on page 5 of the purchase contract, covering sections G3 through H5. G3, vesting and tenancy. This is the line that you would want to put how your client plans to take title to the property. If your client is savvy and already knows how they want to take title, fine, you could put that on this line. Let's say it's Leanna Berwick, joint tenancy with Mark Berwick, or tenancy by the entirety since we're married. If your client already knows how to take title, that would be fine to go ahead and put that in this line. The reason why we put a standard TBD, which stands for to be determined, is because we're not really sure. If you're not really sure how your client plans to take title, or they may not be aware of what that's all about, for the purpose of getting the offer out and off to the seller agent, you want to just go ahead and put something like to be determined there, because they will be getting paperwork from escrow asking how they want to take title. It's my recommendation that it's best that you have your clients consult with escrow on how to take tenancy. Escrow usually will explain to them, they'll have the information and help them along with explaining how tenancy works. You wouldn't want to tell someone how to take tenancy, like if you had a married couple and they never did this before and you told them to do tenancy by the entirety, because maybe that might affect things later if they ever got divorced and having to transfer the property. They might turn around and blame you somehow for you're telling them how to take title. Also, if you were to maybe say something to the effect of doing joint tenancy or tenancy in common, the results of that with property transferring could be somewhat devastating for someone later down the road. You don't want to be the one that was the one that recommended how they do it. So I would recommend that you have them go to escrow to discuss that and figure it all out. And escrow will get that information later when they come in to do the signing, how they want to take title. This is also the part where escrow would need to know at some point, because they're going to need to draft the deed, and that deed is going to indicate the tenancy within it. But again, escrow will mail out a opening escrow packet to your client, in which case they would be asking for that information, so it's not necessary to have it at this point. Same thing, tenancy shall be, again, this could always be TBD. And then we move on to, if buyer has not yet determined vesting in tenancy, buyer shall provide escrow in writing, which is the time frame to provide this information to escrow. We don't want to wait forever for the buyer to get the information to escrow, because this could delay the closing. As I said, escrow will need to know what their vesting is going to be in order to prepare the deed. If for some reason your client wasn't able to get that to escrow until 25 days out, something like that, that could cause a delay in closing, because the attorney will need time to draft the deed. So we usually like to give about 15 days for the buyer to provide that information. But again, they should be aware of that by getting that escrow packet. Let's see, and then moving on to cash funds, financing contingency. Okay, H1, no contingency for obtaining cash funds. If you are working with a contract with a significant down payment, the seller is going to want to know where those funds are coming from. If you've got a VA loan and they're only putting down $1,000, probably not a big deal, because you're going to be giving that $1,000 to escrow. But if they're going to be putting down a significant amount of money as their down payment, the seller is going to want proof that they have the money in the bank, and they're going to want it quite soon. They don't want to wait till after the inspection period is over to find out that the buyer doesn't have the funds. So this is the section which talks about whether or not they have a contingency, and then also providing those proof of funds within a certain period of time. If, let's say, for example, it's a cash deal and they're putting down 50% and they live in Hawaii, most likely they're going to have the funds in a local bank. What kinds of proof of funds out there are things like a bank statement showing that the monies are in the bank, possibly a letter from the bank saying, like somebody has a banker that would be willing to provide a letter with his signature on letterhead, basically saying that this client has the sufficient funds to close the transaction. That would be sufficient. But in any case, whatever the down payment is, that would be what the proof of funds would need to be for. Obviously, if the balance of the funds were coming by way of a loan, that would be a pre-qualification letter, which is in a different section. Sometimes there could be in situations of where someone needs to cash out something to get the money. If my philosophy is this: if you have to do anything to get the money and it's not already in your bank, it's probably going to be a contingency. So that would be my first question to your buyer is, where are your funds? Are they in a local bank? Are they easily accessible? Because that's what the seller is going to be looking for, making sure that those monies are here, accessible. And again, this is the section talking about providing those funds, proof of funds to the seller. So first off is saying that there is no contingency for cash funds. This is going to tell the seller that your funds are available and that you don't need to do anything to get it except basically withdraw it from the bank. The next section here, H1A, talks about verification of those funds, which I just explained is a satisfactory document would be a letter from a banker or bank statements. I like to say at this point that if you are going to be gathering bank statements from your client, that is very important that you provide security and you know, with regard to their account information. You can always black out the information, and really most importantly is the balance on the account. You don't need to show every single page of the statement, just simply the page that shows how much is in there and that it is like a First Hawaiian Bank account or American Savings, something like that, which would show a seller that it is a reputable company that's holding the funds. Anything else might be a little difficult for the seller to accept, and this is a really important thing too to consider when you're working with a Japanese or Chinese client, Canada. Anybody coming from a foreign country would need to have their funds in a reputable corporation or bank of some sort that could be verifiable. So these are really important things to make sure that you talk to your client about, because this is what you're going to have to provide to a seller. So if for some reason you were to get some kind of rinky-dink piece of paper from some weirdo company in Japan that nobody can verify and it's all in Japanese, it's going to have to be a little bit better than that. That would be considered unsatisfactory, and in this case the seller would be able to reject it and possibly cancel the transaction. So it's very important that you don't fool around with this when you are presenting the proof of cash funds, that you do provide some kind of viable document on behalf of your buyer, and also to relay to your buyer what the seller would be expecting. This section here where it talks about the time frame to provide said funds could be a very short period of time. So let's say, for example, you're working with a Japanese client or someone that lives abroad. You might want to give them maybe a little bit more time to provide those verification of funds. Obviously, if they're a local person and they have funds in the bank here, you don't need more than 5 days. You can easily get a bank statement or a letter from a banker relatively quickly. But again, the seller is going to look at this amount of time and go, how come it's going to take so long for me to get verification of your funds? Because they don't know your client, they're not going to be very forgiving of you putting down like $500,000 and not knowing that you really truly have the money. Because if they were to accept this offer based on believing that you have the money in the bank and they're off the market for 10 days, let's say, it would be very stressful for the seller to wait that period of time to find out if your client really truly has the money, because they've taken their property off the market. So they're not going to want to do that. So a short period of time would be the best thing to do, and that's why the standard days would be 5 days here. But again, if you have a client that's abroad, I'm sure it would be understandable to a seller that if they are in a different country that you would need time to acquire that information. But again, reminder to make sure that it is satisfactory, because if it is not satisfactory, then this next paragraph here would apply. If buyer is unable or fails to provide such evidence within the specified time period, seller may elect to terminate the purchase contract. So it's very important that it says such evidence within the specified time period. So that would include the wording satisfactory. So make sure that it is satisfactory. Let's see. Now, if for some reason the funds that the buyer is putting down does have a contingency for getting the money, then you would obviously not select H1. You would put NA here and you would check off H2. And then we would be working with the H2 paragraph. Contingencies for obtaining cash funds could be such things as cashing out a stock stocks or possibly needing to sell another home. That's kind of, I wouldn't say totally common, but it does happen quite a bit where someone needs to sell a house to buy a house. And in which case, if someone needs to sell a house and use the proceeds from the sale of their house to put down on this property, you would need to specify that information here. And where you would get this language would be from this other document that I've been working with here called the Purchase Contract and Counter Offer Standard Contract Terms and Language. You would just scroll down to section H, Contingency for Obtaining Cash Funds when representing a buyer. And then here are some examples of what you might decide to use. So buyer's acceptance of an offer on a sale of a property, buyer's sale of property. You could simply cut and paste from here. And like I said too, if you are using the Zip Forms program, you will want to possibly use the clause editor, which will have all of these languages that could be populated into your Zip Forms account. Okay, so depending again on what type of contingency you're working with, you would want to specify it here on this line. If it's a really big situation or something that needs serious describing, you could always put in here CQ1 and explain this in the special terms section, but I think there should be enough space here for you to do that. Okay, let me just close my Outlook there. Okay, so these are the contingencies within this paragraph. So let's say you did have some stocks you wanted to your client needs to cash out, and it's going to take about 20 days to do that. Sometimes it's not that simple to just go get money from one account and send it to another. It might take a few days to do that, and there might be some penalties and whatnot. So there's a period of time that needs to happen in order for you to get those funds available. You will have a certain period of time that you'll need to get that evidence that's satisfactory to the seller. So the days to put in there, which I am surprised I don't have there, I guess we didn't check it, that's why. But I'd say probably the same thing would be, let's say you had a stock that had $50,000 in it and you were going to use that money to put down towards the sale of the property. If you had, again, an account statement, some kind of statement that showed that your stock was worth $50,000, that would be considered the evidence to provide to the seller. So that's number one. You would need to give the seller something showing that you truly have the money, but the contingency for it would be something different. You would need to have a certain period of time where you would need to be able to get that money's out. But anyway, the evidence is what's the most important thing, is to make sure that you provide the evidence to the seller. Obviously, the cash funds would be due at closing. And again, if this is part of your deposit, you got to make sure that your initial deposit and your additional deposit is coming from another source, because those are triggered by different timeline within the contract. So this would be something outside of the initial and the additional deposit. Okay, letter B, if buyer fails to provide the seller with such satisfactory evidence within the specified time period in H2, A, which means whatever date you put in here, 5 days, 10 days, whatever it is, the seller could also terminate the contract based on either you failed to deliver it or it's not satisfactory. So got to make sure that it's satisfactory. Then we got letter C, if seller is satisfied with the evidence provided in a timely manner, but buyer is unable to ultimately deposit the balance of the down payment into escrow, then buyer may elect to terminate. So basically, if buyer finds out that the stock is not available or cannot cash out the stocks or whatever, then they actually are able to cancel the contract. So, and then the other thing too is if they are not able to get the money, the seller is also able to terminate as well. If the buyer chooses to continue with the contract and try to get the money some other way, the seller would still have an opportunity to cancel. So it's really important that whatever you're going to put here, contingency, is something that is viable, is easily cashed, because the seller is going to look at this. This would not be something that would be something that the seller would like to see, but depending on how long their property has been on the market, maybe they're a little desperate to sell and they're willing to take the risk with you. that are willing to go ahead and go through this process. But anything that you put here could be subject to a counter offer. Okay, so moving along to financing contingency. So if the offer is contingent on a loan, you're probably not going to be doing a contingency, but I have seen it where you're doing all of these things. You've got a contingency for cash funds for a certain portion of the down payment, and then the rest of it is going to be financed by a lender. Not a very strong offer, but you know, it does happen. But in any case, we're going to be working with the loan on this standard contract, so the financing contingency section should be checked, meaning that basically this entire paragraph refers to the loan. Once we get down into section H-4, buyer's obligations for the loan, you're going to be filling out these boxes, and I'm going to cover the boxes. So section A talks about the buyer applying for a mortgage loan. There needs to be a specific period of time that the seller accepts that the buyer is going to be applying for the loan. You can provide a pre-qual letter with nothing. You can call a lender and say, hey, look, here's what I make every year, and I've got this, that, and the other thing, and I'm looking to get a loan for this amount of money. And based on pretty much whatever the buyer is telling the lender, and if everything were to pan out, they're going to provide a pre-qualification letter. So there really isn't much that the lender needs to do a pre-qualification for a buyer. So that's easily obtainable. It's the loan that takes a little while longer, and of course applying for a loan, because there is an application that needs to be filled out, but you don't have to do that before you get a pre-qual. So this first section here talks about when the buyer is going to fill out an application and submit it to a mortgage lender. We don't want him doing that 2 weeks after an acceptance, because it takes a long time for the lender to qualify a buyer. So if you're 2 weeks out and already you're already 2 weeks into the loan, into the escrow, and already you're just applying for a loan, that's just going to tack on more time for the lender to approve you. So a seller's going to want to see a very short time period here. He wants you to hurry up and get your butt in there and get the application going. So we want to put in a standard of about 5 days for that. It shouldn't be that much longer that it would take to fill out an application. So this is pretty much what a seller is going to want to see, maybe even shorter in some cases. The next line down would be the pre-qualification letter. In today's market, we're seeing more and more pre-approvals than we are pre-qualifications, but like I just said, a pre-qualification letter is just simply a letter from a lender saying, based on what the buyer told me, they qualify, but I still need to do a lot of other research on this person to make sure that they qualify for the loan. But just the fact that the buyer has been talking to a lender, and the fact that they've picked a lender, and that they've actually given personal information to a lender is enough for the seller to go, okay, good, they've already started the communication process with a lender. I don't need to wait for them to do that. And then I'm seeing here a reputable company who's talked to this client that says that they're willing to work with them. So you will want to make sure that you talk to your clients about having a pre-qualification letter right at the get-go of presenting an offer. In today's market, there's so many, there's a lot of competition for getting a deal in escrow. You've got bidding wars going on. You want to make sure that you have all your ducks in a row when you present an offer to a seller. So that pre-qualification letter is very important, and you want to make sure that you have that with the offer when you present it to the seller agent. So I would plan on having that be attached to the offer. So again, if you're writing up an offer on the side, you need to be checking with that buyer's lender and getting that pre-qualification letter going, so that by the time you're done writing this offer, you have the pre-qualification letter. So the standard term would be to have it attached to the contract. Okay, the next line down here is, when can the seller expect conditional loan approval? The conditional loan approval is when the lender has already done some preliminary work with the buyer on getting tax information, employment information, basically doing a lot of research on the buyer's finances, pulling credit, as well as the appraisal. Once all of those things are kind of in place and done, the the lender will issue what they call a conditional loan approval. It's not final loan approval. It's something where there might still be some things outstanding, but for the most part, they've done all of their research on the buyer, and they're about ready to provide final loan approval. But there's just a few little checks on the checklist that need to be done, and usually they will provide on the conditional loan approval what is still outstanding. That is what the seller wants to see. They want to see that they've done most of the things that need to be done in order to get the loan. But then on top of that, they want to see what might also be outstanding. Maybe there's credit report that hadn't been done, or maybe there was some tax information that hasn't been verified. That might send some red flags to the seller to go, hey, are you even able to get this loan? But anyways, it's that communication process with the seller to make sure that seller feels comfortable that you are moving forward with the loan process and are aware of any pitfalls that you might be having with your client. The information to put on line C here would be, when should that conditional loan approval be delivered to the seller? You have no clue when that's going to be. So because you're not the lender, you don't know what's going on behind the scenes. But the way we somewhat calculate this is we have a little bit of a formula that we use by what I tend to do with the formula is I go with the closing date, and I go 18 days from the closing date to deliver the conditional. That's plenty of time for the lender to get a conditional out the door, and it's also plenty of time for the lender to, after they provide conditional loan approval, to prepare for final loan approval. And the reason for this is that there is a process with closing and the lender and with escrow. Escrow needs 2 days prior to closing for all documents and funds to be in prior to recordation. So the way that we factor this in, so let's say for example our closing date was January 31st, and we were to count back 18 days. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. So let's say the 18th day is January 13th. Okay? That would be the day that I'm telling the seller that I will deliver conditional loan approval to you. So from the beginning of the contract, the acceptance date, to the 13th, let's just say, there's like a 2 to 3 week process there, and then we've got conditional loan approval. From this time frame, we're going to give an additional 10 days for the lender to provide the final loan approval. So here we got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. Now we're on the 23rd. So let's say, for example, the lender is going to provide the final loan approval on the 23rd. Final loan approval doesn't mean that they're getting ready to give the money out. They're not ready to fund yet. They're just giving final loan approval. Once final loan approval is given in a form of a letter to the buyer saying, congratulations, you now have final loan approval, from that day they need to prepare documents for signing. So the day they give final loan approval, I would guesstimate about a 2 to 3 day process for them to prepare documents for printing for signing. So depending on whatever day this falls on, you're going to need at least 2 or 3 days for that. So I would say, let's say this falls on a Monday, you're going to prepare a signing with, not you, but the lender will contact the buyer and say, we've got the documents ready for signing, please come down to my office, let's sign all the papers. And usually at that time the buyer will be signing escrow documents as well. They tend to do both at the same time, and a lot of times the lender will sign both the loan documents and the escrow documents at the same time. Once the buyer has signed all of the documents, the lender takes the originals and provides them to escrow, and then I think they have their own back office process that they do with the documents, and then they issue funding. So like I said, they may be doing their signing here and the documents are turned back over to the lender and escrow has them. You need, like I said, 2 days prior to recordation, which I would say would be the 31st. You would need to have everything done by the 29th in order to close by the 31st. So this is still pushing it a little close, but it's still enough time that we feel would be necessary in order to get all of those things done in order to close in a timely manner. So our formula would be to provide the conditional loan approval. You would want to count back from your closing date 18 days and put on this line 18 days prior to closing. On the next line would be the days after the seller receives the conditional loan approval, how many days to get it to the seller for final loan approval. And that would be a typical 10 days. And then the balance of the time would be used for preparing documents, funding, and all of that to close by whatever your closing date would be. And I don't ever have a problem. I mean, I don't ever see a lender having a problem with this formula. They're usually able to do it. And it's a very, very comfortable timeline. If you have a certain situation where you want to deviate from this, by all means, that's fine. But this is just a standard, and I just kind of explained to you our reasoning for doing it this way. And last but not least, we want to just explain that H-5 is a termination provision for the seller that should buy or fail to satisfy any obligation under this above paragraphs here, that if they don't do it within the period of time, that the seller may elect to terminate the purchase contract pursuant to 03 of the contract. And again, we're going to cover the termination section a little later in a different tutorial. Okay, so that concludes the purchase contract, page 5, G3 through H5.